to Ramsey Library Brown Bag Talks. I'm Gene Hod. I'm head of special collections, and I wrangle these talks up. I get these talks together, and we're real excited today to have Dave Erb back. Dave was here 4 years ago, Dave, maybe?
Something like that.
And a great talk on electronic cars, as you might not be surprised to hear. And that's actually been recorded and is on our website, and it's worth going and checking that out. Really great talk. And we're very glad to have Dave back today. A few little housekeeping things. For those of you who've used Zoom, you know it tends to work a lot better if everybody stays muted while the speaker is speaking. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and at that point in time, you can just unmute and ask your question, and Dave will field your answer. And just as a way of introduction, Dave retired 2 years ago from the mechatronics engineering program here at UNC Asheville, where he taught for 10 years. And please welcome Dave Erb.
Thanks. I'm going to share a screen here to get started. Let's see. Okay, so as Gene said, I'm an automotive engineer. I spent most of my career as a college professor, but I also had and I taught both engineering and by day and business by moonlight. But I also had a period of time where I was a consultant, self-employed, and I started my career in the heavy truck and transit bus industry. I'm a lifelong outdoorsman. I'm a committed environmentalist. I'm a public transit advocate, and I'm a former racer and a passionate auto enthusiast, and I see no contradiction in anything I've just told you. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a few minutes. The bulk of my 4 decades as an automotive engineer was focused on energy and emissions work. I've worked with developed vehicles with pretty much any fuel you've heard of, hydrogen being the one exception. I also, in the mid-'80s, started working with electric vehicles. And it became pretty clear to me right off the bat that if you look at the big picture, electric powertrains are the future of land transportation. There's just no getting around it. I've worked on about 50 electric and hybrid electric vehicle development projects over the years, of which I call a dozen of them mine, where I had a significant leadership role, a lot of blood, sweat, toil, and tears invested in them. What I want to talk about today, I want to start out talking about Driving to Net Zero, which is a book. I want to talk about my chapter, which is the first chapter in the book, and read a little bit from it. But then I want to broaden out the focus a little bit to sustainable transportation in general and electricity in comparison to the other options we have in specifics. And I hope most of the time we can spend on open discussion and questions and just discussing mainly electric vehicles, but also renewable energy and anything about sustainable transportation that strikes your fancy. Driving to Net Zero is a book that was pulled together by my friend Dave Hrivnak. He lives up in Kingsport, Tennessee. It's a collection of 15 chapters. Each chapter is a first-person account of a family that's combined electric vehicles, solar houses, and other sustainability strategies. We cover pretty much most of the U.S., and there's actually one Canadian chapter. We cover a wide range of the ideological spectrum and motivations for why we did this. We're all homeowners, so obviously we don't go too much into the realm of poor people, but within that constraint, we do cover a pretty broad portion of the socioeconomic spectrum. And again, there's 15 chapters. I wrote chapter 1, and so I want to start out reading to you from that chapter. My chapter is called An Unapologetic Car Junkie. So here's the opening part of that chapter. It says, I love cars. Actually, I love vehicles, skateboards to spacecraft, biplanes to bass boats, and everything in between. But I really love cars. Some of my first and fondest memories are associated with the ambitious road trips my family took every year. I learned early that cars granted access to the world, or at least to the continent. In 1969, the year I turned 13, my mother hauled 4 kids and assorted friends to Key West, Florida in the spring, then to Anchorage, Alaska in the summer. We camped right beside the Alcan Highway, tents pitched next to a white over green VW bus, 23 windows and a canvas sunroof, cheap cans and spare tires, and a roof rack over the driver and front passenger. If there was a bridge to Hawaii, we'd have driven there too. Truth be told, the access and the experiences and the vehicles had become completely intermingled long before 1969. And access, though certainly desirable and of great interest, was just one facet of the enjoyment of automobiles, and not entirely necessary at that. Cars had already acquired meaning and beauty in and of themselves as cultural artifacts, even in the total absence of practical transportation value. The watershed year was 1963. I had been vaguely aware of auto racing. My mother used to tell stories of family picnics in her childhood backyard, listening to the Indianapolis 500 on the radio, back when 500 miles meant an all-day affair. But racing had no real presence in my life until 1963, when I saw an advertisement in a magazine. I don't recall the product, but I still remember the layout of that ad. The picture of 1963 Indy winner Parnelli Jones was featured near the top, with smaller pictures of Jim Clark, second, and AJ Foyt, third, side by side below him. But the pictures weren't really of the drivers. They were pre-race photos of the drivers in their cars, and 2 of those photos might as well have been invisible. Jim Clark's mid-engine Lotus was the shining green and gold apogee of technology, as sleek and modern as NASA's rockets, just then in transition from Mercury to Gemini. The traditional front-engine roadsters that Jones and Foyt drove could have been ox carts for all I cared. The existential truth of art had revealed itself to a 7-year-old. So I went on to study aerospace engineering and become an automotive engineer, and had this 4-decade career as an automotive engineer. It focused after about 1992 on electric vehicles, but I use the term EV or electric vehicle inclusively. Any vehicle that uses an electric motor for its traction, in my book, is an EV. And EVs have been around since 1880. They predate internal combustion cars by about 5 years. But when you're talking, and they never went away, even though we think of them as having disappeared, they were in various market niches throughout the century plus since then. But when you talk about modern, mass market, mainstream electric vehicles that you might have in your garage as your passenger car, in the US, for US consumers, that market starts in December of 1999. That's when the Insight first showed up at Honda dealers. The Prius had been around in Japan for about a year or 2 before that, but it showed up in the Toyota dealers in the US about a month later. And those cars were charge-sustaining HEVs. The H stands for hybrid. It means they combine gas engines with the electric motors. The charge-sustaining piece means that they manage the charge in the batteries by the way they burn fuel in the engine and the way they control the brakes. And you could see that back then in the early advertising. There was a lot of emphasis on the electric car you never plug in. Current day Lexus hybrid advertising talks about the self-charging electric car. They're charge-sustaining vehicles, but there are really, really good reasons to plug in your car. The bulk of the advantages, the vast majority of the advantages of electric transportation come from shifting from oil over to the electric grid. And so 11 years later, to the month, we get our first PEVs, plug-in electric vehicles in the US. There were 2 of them. And they take 2 different technological approaches. The Nissan Leaf is a battery electric vehicle, a BEV. Some people would call it a pure electric vehicle. Think of it like a giant cell phone. You charge up the battery, you drive around. When the battery gets low, you put it back on a charger. The Chevy Volt is a plug-in hybrid or a PHEV or a PHEV. It's like the Leaf. You charge up a big battery, you drive around in pure electric mode, but when the battery gets low, you have an option. And it will seamlessly shift into a charge sustaining mode. And just like a Prius or even a conventional car, you can drive it as long as you keep gas in the tank. So three different technological approaches to electrification. Takes 5 acronyms to describe them. That's probably a commentary or there's a moral in there somewhere, I guess. Now, when you look at all the data I've looked at over the years, it's pretty clear we need to do 4 things if we're going to maintain the benefits that we enjoy from our transportation system. And they can be done independently. They do not, there are synergies when you combine them, but they don't have to be done in any specific order. So I've listed them here in what I think of, in the order that I think of as kind of the sustainability mantra. And that is conservation amplifies technology, or it enhances technology. So the first thing that I've listed here is we just really need to reduce our demand for motorized transportation. We need to replace some of our physical motion with thought instead of physical motion. Second thing is we need to, when we do put vehicles out there, we need to use them more productively than we presently do. And you do that by matching them, doing a better job of matching them to their load than we presently do. Third, we need to electrify the powertrains to the maximum extent that the vehicle mission deems to be feasible. This will be dictated not by the vehicle, but by the mission it's performing as to how much electrification is appropriate. And then finally, since the vast majority of missions are going to lend themselves to plug-in electrification, we need to put renewable electricity out on the grid, and we should emphasize distributed photovoltaics, lots of small photovoltaic arrays, PV arrays, out like on everybody's house rather than massive centralized farms. The way to remember this is just picture a motor scooter and a solar panel. The first step is to reduce your demand. Well, you're not going to commute to Greenville and back every day on a scooter, so we got that one covered. Second step is to match the vehicle to its load. Scooter does that really well. Third step is to electrify the powertrain. An electric scooter will consume well under 100 watt hours of energy per mile traveled. Just for reference, a gasoline scooter uses over 300 watt hours of energy per mile. And then finally, the fourth step is renewables. A 200 watt solar panel, which is really fairly small by today's standards, will put 600 watt hours of electricity on the grid every day, year-round average, pretty much anywhere in this country. Here in Asheville, it'll be somewhere between 800 and 900 watt hours a day from that panel. So if you took those 4 steps to this level, then you would get well over 5 miles a day of clean transportation at a very affordable price. And there's nothing that OPEC or anybody else can say about it. You get to do this because you chose to do it. Now, those 4 steps are going to look different for everybody who adopts them. For my wife and me, we live in a relatively small, totally electric house about a mile north of campus. It's got 6 kilowatts of solar panels on the roof. That's enough to take the house well past net zero. In the course of a year, those panels generate way more electricity than the house uses. It's actually enough to cover the house usage plus about 6,000 miles of car usage. Unfortunately or fortunately, since I retired, we now have 2 electric cars, and we want to travel. We would be traveling if it weren't for COVID. And so we're not at net zero if you count the house plus the cars, but we're working on it. It's a work in progress. And that work is made a lot easier by the fact that it pays for itself. If you put here in Asheville, if you put PV panels on your roof and you roll it into the cost of your mortgage, it's financially equivalent to lock it in gas for a Prius at $1.23 a gallon. If you are trading in the average American car, and not a Prius, it's equivalent to locking in gas for that car at 62 cents a gallon. So it's a slam dunk financially to take this step. It also adds to the value of your house far more than it costs you to put the PV on the roof. So you don't have to wait 30 years for this to pay off. If you need to sell your house in another year, it's a good move. There are also a whole bunch of vehicular reasons to go electric that have nothing to do with energy and emissions. But the fact is, those would not have been enough to get anybody to make the investment it takes to get a car company up and running like Tesla, or for an existing company to shift over its production. That took a law, to be blunt. The California Air Resources Board, if it hadn't been for CARB, the California Air Resources Board, there'd be no such thing as a Toyota Prius, and therefore no such thing as a Tesla, and therefore no such thing as a Nissan Leaf or a Chevy Volt. These cars exist because we're trying to reduce mobile source emissions. They have no tailpipe emissions. They also have less global emissions and less global energy consumption in a universal sense. People in my business get really focused on what we call a field to wheels energy cycle. You look at energy, you start at the oil field, the coal field, the corn field, wherever it is you're getting primary energy. You follow that energy all through the conversions it takes to get to where the rubber meets the road. And electric vehicles plus their charging infrastructure are both cleaner and more efficient than conventional vehicles plus the fueling infrastructure. The other reason for going, another reason for going electric is because of the efficiency of electric vehicles. Any sustainable system is going to have to ultimately boil down to using present solar budget. We can't continue to pull ancient sunlight out of the ground and burn it. We're going to have to use current solar budget in real time or something close to real time in order to be sustainable in the long run. And efficiency matters. When you look at collecting sunshine, efficiency matters because it dictates how much space you have to use, how much area it takes to collect that sunshine. There's really only two ways to do it. You can turn it into electricity, wind, hydro, and solar photovoltaic and the like are electric ways of collecting sunshine. Excuse me just a second. The other way to do it is to grow biofuels. But biofuels are so much less efficient than the electrically based ways of doing it, that you're effectively talking about starving 2 billion of the world's poorest people. And it's not so that you can have transportation for the richest 2 billion. It's so that you can avoid changing the way you feed the cars of the richest 2 billion. Biofuels are a crime against humanity. We should be fighting it tooth and nail. We should never be putting mobility and nutrition in competition for resources. I can use the roof of my house and I haven't used any of to generate electricity, and I haven't used any of my garden space. I can still grow food. Same thing is true on a broader scale. The other reason why I think it's really critical to go electric is that oil is at the center of most of the geopolitical mayhem of the last century plus. The Nazis justified their invasions of Europe and Asia and North Africa on the basis of a doctrine called Lebensraum. Lebensraum translates literally as living room or living space. But what it really meant was that they believed they had a divine right to other people's resources, and that those resources specifically meant grain and fossil fuels. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor for almost identical reasons to the Nazi Anschluss and the like. The Suez Crisis up here in 1956, that was basically fought, or not fought, but there was the threat of a fight over over the flow of oil out of the Middle East. And that's really an interesting one because the Suez Crisis, during the Suez Crisis, the United States two enemies were Great Britain and Israel. Think about that one for a second in light of today's politics. Vietnam, when Vietnam was known as French Indochina, when it was a colony, the South exported rice and the North exported fossil fuels, mainly oil. There's a reason why 50,000 American soldiers and hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of innocent peasants died in what was supposedly a Cold War. This is a moral issue. We need to reduce, we need to put the oil, we need to take petroleum and move it back to an important, useful commodity and away from the position it presently holds of the driver of world geopolitics and strife. One more point, not to belabor this too much, but most of the dark money that perverts our political system coalesces around oil industry money. It's not all from the oil industry, but it coalesces around oil industry money. We need to weaken that negative power of the oil industry and make oil just go back to being a useful commodity and not the driver of the world's politics. So on that cheery note, I'd love to take questions and entertain discussion now. So I'll stop sharing this screen for the moment. Who's got a question or a comment?
Yeah, so thanks so much for this. Thanks for the encouragement. Like Dot said, I'm with her. I wouldn't have my Leaf without, or my electric bike if it hadn't been for your talks. So I'm interested in solar power to charge my Leaf, but it seems to me the best way to do it, the only way, as far as I can see, would be like with a car cover that's made of a solar fabric. Do you know anything about, the status of flexible materials and whether people have, charging car covers?
There are flexible materials that so photovoltaics that are on flexible substrates, and mostly they exist to go into mobile applications like motorhomes and the like, because they're not as brittle, and so they can stand the shock and vibration environment of being driven around. But I'd really like to discourage everyone from, not just you, from thinking in terms of you've got to have the solar on the car. Both of my cars have license plates that misspell solar car, and that leads to some really interesting discussions at electric vehicle chargers. People will tell me they're not solar cars. Well, I would argue they are solar cars. It's just that my solar panels are where they belong. They're not being driven around on the top of my car where I got to use energy to transport them around. B, I have to have a less efficient solar panel because it needs to be able to stand the shock and vibration environment. And C, it's not going to be generating anything if it's in my garage or parked under a tree or something like that. If it's pointed the wrong way. On the roof of my house, they're always pointed the right direction. And then the fourth reason, if I dedicate the solar panels to the car and don't allow them to be used anywhere else, once the car is fully charged, the output from those solar panels has nowhere to go. And so I really want the solar panels on the grid, and then I want to charge the car off of the grid. The grid is the community in action, basically. It's the way we pool resources to be more effective at using them. So that's kind of my take on putting the panels on the car. They really don't belong on the car.
I have an answer back, but I'm going to be quiet and let others step in.
I think Sam tried to unmute his mic.
Yeah. Do you have anything written up about the best way to solarize your house?
It is kind of dependent on your house. I know Dot has solar panels on her house, and her situation is pretty different than mine. So what I would really recommend is contact 2 or 3 of the solar installers. Dot's moving her camera so you can see her panels. So contact 2 or 3 of the solar installers. We've got some really great solar installers in this area. Some of them have been doing it a long time, and there's some that are even fairly new, but they're really good at it and very ethical businesses. And just have them come out. They'll look at what your best option is. It might be a ground mount system like Dot's showing you. It might be a roof mounted system like the one I have. Just depends on where you are and what the situation is.
So a list of those ethical solar providers, are they just look in the phone book, or do you have something like that?
Tell people, start with the 3 S's: Sundance, Soul Farm, and Sugar Hollow. And I think Dot had somebody else do hers, so let her chime in.
I'm going to throw in Asheville Solar because Asheville Solar is a small organization. I was their first customer, I think. And I had the advantage of my brother, who's a professional engineer, who kind of oversaw everything. He has a net zero house, and they give him money for his excess solar in Eastern Shore, Maryland. But Asheville Solar is run by a young man who is just delightful. And it's kind of more local even than Sundance. It's a small thing and really wonderful. And the reason I have those things over there is because my house is in the shade. And so I can't have solar on my roof.
Dave, I have a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of stepping up a little bit, asking from a little bit bigger perspective, kind of hearkening back on your international politics question that, in August, due to the lack of demand, one of the largest oil companies in the world, BP, has no longer going to be doing exploration for oil in new places. They're going to slash oil production by 40%, lower carbon emissions, and then boost capital and spending on low carbon energy. Do you think that this is a trend that might get larger as the pandemic goes on?
I think even without the pandemic, I actually view electrification of transportation and the shift to renewables as inevitable. It's the only thing that's going to stop it is the existing market power of people with a vested interest in the status quo. That's going to slow us down, but it's just so compelling. And in fact, this is when I read the last thing I'm going to read out of my chapter. I'm going to comment more on this, but right now, solar with storage is winning wholesale electric bids in places you would never imagine, like Minnesota, places you don't think of as sunshiny, bright spots. Wind with storage is winning wholesale electric bids in all sorts of places. So I really see this stuff, and I think of wind and hydro as just other forms of solar energy. So I really see this happening. And on top of that, with the cars, electric vehicles are just better vehicles, to be blunt. Engineers spend billions of dollars, and that's with a B, working on what they call NVH, noise, vibration, and harshness. Well, it's a little different problem with an electric car, but it's so much easier with an electric car. They're still going to spend money, and engineers are still going to be working on making things sound good to you, and the harshness that comes through feel better to you. But it's so much easier with an electric car, and companies spend billions on this with existing conventional cars. So there's just so many reasons. The maintenance is so much lower on electric vehicles. You never have an oil change. You never have a timing belt replacement. All these little things that aren't little things, they add up in terms of the time it takes to get them done and the money it takes to do them. And you just don't spend it at all with an electric car. So I think the oil companies are in for a rocky road. If you remember back in June, the price of oil futures actually went negative. people had to pay money to get people to take delivery contracts off their hands. That's unprecedented, and that's not going to be unusual. The oil industry is going to stay really volatile. I actually view that as one of my jobs in life, is by encouraging electric cars, I can lower the price of gas for all the people who really can't shift over yet. It's dramatic. I don't think we're ever going to see market forces push oil prices way up again. I just don't see it happening.
Hey, Dave, could you repeat the 3 S's? I got Sundance, but I missed the last 2.
Yeah, the other 2 that I like, and I partly it's because I know these people personally, partly because I know people who've had really good experiences with them. Sundance, Soul Farm, SOLFARM, and Sugar Hollow.
And
Again,
Asheville Solar.
and then Asheville Solar, Dot mentioned. This is by no means an exhaustive list. We've got great solar installers in this area.
Yeah, I got Asheville Solar as well too, but I got the first and the last, but I missed the ones in the middle. So thank you.
And I notice I have to blow the leaves off my panels there.
And Dave, one other question. Roughly, what's the cost, the output that you have to install solar on the house? I know it's different for everybody, but roughly.
Yeah, it costs these days about a good number, not considering the tax credits or anything like that, which are going to change again. They're going to drop a little bit again after the end of the year. But just completely raw cost before you consider any incentive type things, it's about $2.65 a watt these days is a reasonable number to be looking at. It might be a little higher than that or a little lower than that, depending on your installation, but that's a reasonable number. And just to give you an idea, my house is 6,000 watts, 6 kilowatts. So that would be something under $18,000 raw cost before you consider the incentives and the like. And I do want to emphasize again, because you'll hear people say, well, I'm not going to live in my house for 30 years to make it pay off. It actually, you pay, let's call it $3 a watt, just for an easy roundable number for the system before you get these tax credits in the like. But there's beginning to be enough of a data set out there to estimate what it adds to the value, the resale value of your house. And it's looking like it's between $4 and $5 a watt. So it's one of the few home renovations you can do that actually raises the value of your house by more than you paid for it. And it's by a pretty good margin when you consider the tax credits.
Thanks.
I'll tell you what, let me do this right now. I'm gonna shut off my alarm and read a little bit the end of my chapter of my book, and then show my contact information, and then maybe we'll have some more questions and comments in the interim. Maybe this will stimulate a few more. The end section of my chapter is titled "The Case for Optimism," and it starts like this. Throughout the 4 decades that I've been paying close attention, progress towards mass EV adoption has been characterized by a halting herky-jerky, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. The same has been true for renewable energy. But the world's movement toward environmental sanity has been underway for a long time and enjoys broad-based support. Where solar-powered EVs are concerned, there's plenty of reason to believe we're finally at a point where any future detours will be minor, as long as we do our part to stay on course. Jim Clark and Team Lotus, sometimes ridiculed immigrants from Eurocentric Formula One, may have been anomalies at Indy in 1963, but they didn't stay that way for long. Lotus, A.J. Watson, and other teams ran mid-engine cars in 1964, with Roger Ward finishing second in a Watson entry. Then in 1965, assisted by another group of outsiders, NASCAR's legendary Wood Brothers pit crew, Clark and Lotus finally broke through to win what is arguably the most important race in the world. And though one lone quixotic diehard, Jim Hurtubise, kept hoping and striving long past the point of rationality, no front engine roadster has been even remotely competitive at the Brickyard since. It would be almost impossible to overstate the enormity of this change. The Indy Roadster was the ultimate evolution of a basic automotive layout that predates the Model T. The mechanics who built the Roadsters were craftsmen of the highest order, artists in steel, magnesium, and aluminum. Tough blue-collar brawlers like Parnelli Jones had biceps bigger than my thighs with attitudes to match, on track and off. Green, the official British color in international racing, had long been considered bad luck on US race cars, taboo at American tracks. The Lotus didn't transform Indy because it was green or foreign, or even because it was exotically attractive to impressionable 7-year-olds. Neither did Jim Clark, a soft-spoken Scottish gentleman farmer, win because he was polite. The physics of a streamlined, balanced mid-engine design are simply too compelling to ignore. Engineers like Colin Chapman speak in elegant, calculating poetry all their own and employ their own talented artisans to give it form. A well-engineered setup changes race driving from a wrestling match into a test of aerobic capacity and thermal endurance, perfectly suited for slender, fit athletes like Jim Clark. And superstition, no matter how widely held, is just ignorance with a backstory. Any technology as well matched to its time and task as the Lotus will inevitably prevail. The tipping point, reached at lightning pace in the meritocracy of a racetrack, arrives a lot slower and harder fought in a world where economic incumbency and societal inertia confer the power to hobble competition. But whining about unfairness is a waste of irreplaceable time. Driving on sunshine is every bit as compelling as the mid-engine Indy car, and real companies have already stepped up, happily selling PV and EVs in non-trivial quantities, which means that today, just like yesterday and tomorrow, advocates for rational transportation have a full day's work ahead of us. If you've seen the future too, recognize that you're on the right side of history, and remember the words of Andy Warhol. They always say that time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself. So don't just sit there, roll up your sleeves, and whistle while you work. So again, I really, let me try to put my contact information up. And let me also, I blog about electric vehicles for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And if you'll just go to their website, cleanenergy.org, and type in the search line Dave Erb EV blogs or something like that, you'll find the blogs that I've done. The first series that I did for SACE was focused on EV charging, and it's basically for all the little weird things that are different when you buy an EV. They're not really hard once you learn what to do, but it's like when you got your first cell phone and you kept dropping calls because you couldn't swipe the screen right. It's those little weird things like that. The first series of 4 blogs that I did for SACE are about those kinds of things. And the series we're working on right now is about some of the misinformation that's out there. So does anybody have more questions? I'll stick around as long as anybody's interested.
I have a question, Dave.
All righty.
So, when I hear about electric vehicles and charging electric vehicles and so on, I part of me kind of rebels, even though like I bought a Leaf and I'm going to be plugging in. Part of me rebels, and it's because sort of implicit in this narrative is a story of privilege, right? Like, who's going to be able to put up solar panels but landed gentry, for example? who has the money to purchase a solar car, except for somebody who's got more than $2,000 in savings. Um, these are tough issues. The car that I'm selling, for example, which is like a car that was pieced together from lots of other vehicles, that's more appropriate for most of folks in America these days, I guess, if they really looked at their budgets. Um, so I'd like to hear you comment on that.
Well, yeah, and it's a wonderful question, and it's a place where the conversation, frankly, gets derailed by disinformation. The reality is that new cars are expensive. Period. End of story. And even if you're buying, the lowest end car that's out there on the market, a Nissan Versa, a Chevy Spark, the really low end things. If you're buying a new one as opposed to a used one, then you're choosing to indulge in a luxury. That new car smell is the most expensive perfume in the world. It's a luxury item. And so even at the bottom end of the market, the person who buys the car from the dealer is actually, by my definition, a rich person. If you weren't, you'd be buying your Escort for $1,300, right? and so as counterintuitive as this sounds, consumerism is actually a pretty good thing. New car depreciation is one of the few places in the world where trickle-down economics actually works. If a rich person buys a new car and they get tired of it and they sell it at a fairly significant loss, when you're just driving it off the lot, it loses 15, 20, 30% of the value just because someone else owned it before the second owner. And so as bizarre as it sounds, probably the most environmentally good thing that could happen in the transportation world is if rich people would buy the cleanest, greenest, newest thing and get tired of it really fast, lease it, and when the 2-year lease is up, get a different one. Because the only cars that auto manufacturers manufacture are new cars. And new cars are only bought by rich people rich enough to buy that perfume, right? And so the best thing you could do is if the wealthiest among us would buy the cleanest cars and then push them out into the food chain where they can then slowly move to the less well-off people in society, instead of buying Hummers and Escalades and Expeditions and these huge gas-guzzling things. Let's get the food chain filled with EVs and instead of these gas guzzlers.
And my car was only $11,000. That wasn't very expensive, and doesn't cost much to run it.
Yeah, and right now I have a Chevy Spark EV, and you couldn't ever buy them new in North Carolina, but you can bring them in used from the states where you could buy them new, and there's a lot of them out there under 10,000. And I just saw there's a little electric version of the Fiat Cinquecento, the little 500 Fiat. I just saw one of those down in Atlanta with 12,000 miles on it for $6,000. It's really, the used car market for electric vehicles is really an amazing thing. That there's a fear there's fear that's been pushed out there about battery life and the like. People, the people who don't want you to buy an electric car have pushed out this narrative that the batteries are going to die at 25,000 miles, and it's going to cost you $30,000 to replace them, which is as much as the car costs, all of which is just total nonsense. It's not true, but that narrative has taken hold. And so the vast to a much higher degree than is true with combustion vehicles, people lease electric vehicles. And so there's this constant stream of gently used electric vehicles coming off lease at 2 or 3 years old. And that depresses the price because there's a lot of them. And then there's that narrative that the batteries are going to die and it's going to cost you a fortune to replace it. And so that one is not true, but it further heightens that fear that people have about buying used cars and pushes the prices down. And then there's actually a place where optimism works against us. People are convinced that the miracle battery is just going to happen next week, and it's not, folks. It just simply isn't. The miracle battery has already been gotten. It's when we made the shift from the nickel chemistries to lithium, and now the improvements are going to be incremental. We're going to work on lithium batteries, and we're going to continue to improve them. And there's a lot of improvements still to be had, but it's going to come a lot harder than the shift from nickel to lithium was. And so that optimism about the miracle battery, which is unfounded, also leads people to not want to buy the used car or the new one. They want to lease the new one. And so it plays into this thing. So the used electric vehicles are so much cheaper than their counterparts, than a comparable gasoline vehicle. And the other thing I'm going to say on this note, there's a narrative out there pushed even by some people who are advocates that says that EVs are more expensive than combustion vehicles. That is just not true. I have a Tesla Model 3. The car that I would have bought if I had not wanted an electric car is a BMW 330. That car, the BMW, costs more than the Tesla cost me. And so that's a high-end car, but I would have had a high-end gasoline car if I hadn't bought it. I'm retired, and I finally said, I've been a car junkie all my life. I'm going to have a nice car. And so when you look at the average selling price of an EV, it is significantly higher than the average selling price of an internal combustion car. But that's because over 60% of the electric vehicles in this country are Teslas. So the average conventional car, the new car price, is about $38,000. But that's a Honda Accord, a Toyota Camry, a Ford Fusion. The average EV in this country the price is higher, but it's because it's comparable to a fairly loaded Mercedes or Lexus. It's a Tesla, right? And so it's really not true, even with new electric vehicles, that they're more expensive. And then when you get to the used ones, it's just no contest. They're cheaper than comparable gasoline cars. And when we get to the point where they've had enough time to rust out and have bald tires, you'll be able to buy them for $500, just like you buy, the sacrificial anode, the beater car from the place where they salt the roads. Any other comments or questions?
I want to thank you, Dave. It was really interesting.
Thank you for being here. Thanks to everybody for being here. I do want to mention one thing real quickly. The other thing that you'll hear sometimes is that you've just got a combustion, you got a coal-fired car with a longer tailpipe. Go to the Union of Concerned Scientists and look at, or look at my blogs with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and you'll really understand why that's a pretty bogus argument. They are cleaner dramatically with both criteria pollutants, the noxious emissions that we've been regulating since the 60s, and they're cleaner on greenhouse gases today. You don't even have to have improvement. And the average car is going to be on the road for about 25 years. The average age of the cars on the road are about 12 years. So if you buy a car, an EV today, the grid profile that tells you that's most representative of its lifetime emissions isn't even going to be on the grid for another 12 years. So they're already cleaner, and the grid is getting cleaner really fast. So by the time your car that you buy today is at the midpoint of its life, it's already so much cleaner, but it'll be way cleaner then.
Dave, I'm trying to find that blog on the cleanenergy.org site. What do I search for?
Okay, in the search line, type in Dave Erb and just EV blogs or something like that, and you'll find at least one of them.
I typed in Dave Erb and your blogs came up easily.
Okay. And there's two series. The first four are on EV charging, and the current series that I think we've got 3 of them up. There's another couple in the hopper that haven't been published yet. They're on misinformation.
Oh, so the one about the pollution, longer tailpipe, would that be EVs are here, plug in now, emissions, smoke and mirrors?
Yes, that's the one.
Great title.
I need the charging one. The only places I know to charge are my house and Ingalls.
Plug
And
share.
UNCA.
Plug share. Put the Plug Share app on your phone.
Yeah, I'm actually, well, Dave, hey, while I have you for 4 more minutes. So you're familiar with Roanoke, Virginia, right? That's my stomping grounds and Dave's.
Being my hometown, yes.
So I'm going to be going back there, and I usually stay, now that COVID is here, I camp out with friends on Pilot Mountain. Okay?
Mhm.
So to get to Pilot Mountain, I may have to push the car once I get to halfway up. Anyway, I was thinking maybe I'll go to Christiansburg first and then cut up for, charge at like a place up there and then go up the mountain. Have you thought about those kind of logistics?
Not with your car. An 80-mile car is a very different calculation than a 300-mile car. But I know there's charging up near Boone. That's fast charging. You can use your CHAdeMO port.
Okay.
I'm really not sure of how you get to Roanoke with an 80-mile car from here, but I also believe it's probably doable.
Oh, I'm going to do it. I'll let you know how I figure it out.
Paula, the person who is always doing that is Rudy in Math Lab. Do you know Rudy B. Harry's thing? He's always trying to go on long trips with an 80-mile charging car. He's very good at that.
Yeah, it's sport to Rudy, so he's the guy to ask.
Yeah, it feels like sport to me too. Not to everyone, I guess, right? So we're gonna be cutting edge here. So yeah.
I gotta go. Thank you all.
Thanks, Doc. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Paula.
Yeah. Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Dave. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks to everybody, even the people who've said nothing like Bill.
Take care, everybody.